Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I am doing my favorite reads of 2020. I had such a great reading year and so many books that I loved. I actually had 72 5-star reads, so even narrowing it down to this list was very, very hard. And I do my list a little bit differently than some other channels. I do 10 categories, which change each year depending on what types of books I read, and give a ranked top 3 within each of those categories. So I will have timestamps linked down below in case you only are interested in certain types of books. Or you could treat each of these categories as grabbing the top 1 from each, and then it'll be a top 10 list. But since there are so many books, I am going to go through them fairly quickly. Most of these I do have standalone reviews for though, so I will link all of those in the description below, and I will tell you when I have a standalone review for it so that you can know to check it out if you're interested in more detail. Also, just as a note, these are all books that I read in 2020, not 2020 releases necessarily. The first category is middle grade, starting with Other Words for Home by Jasmine Warga. This is a beautiful story told in verse about a young girl, Jude, who lives in Syria but has to leave with her mom to come to the US because there is a lot of kind of civil war going on in Syria and it's not safe for them there. So it's a lot about her journey and about the connection she feels both with her home in Syria and with living in America and kind of the new friends and new lifestyle that she's forming there. There's a lot of discussion as well about things like Islamophobia, and I just love the way that it's written. It's super powerful. I love the verse. It's gorgeous writing. I do have a standalone review for that, so I will link it below, and I loved this book so much. Next is A Mixture of Mischief by Meriano. This is the third book in the Love, Sugar, Magic series, and it was such a beautiful conclusion to the trilogy. This is sort of an urban fantasy set in Texas that follows a family of brujas. So we are focused on the youngest daughter in a large family, Leo, who discovers in the first book that her family are brujas and they put magic into their baking. She very much wants to participate. In each story, she maybe gets into some trouble as she tries to do a lot of magic that is perhaps not what her family is okay with her doing. So in this third book, I think that it really brings a lot together, really talks about her desire to do more magic and how her family really brings her into that, brings her into the bakery. It also talks a lot about the heritage of magic and about different ways to use magic and different sort of ideas about what the purpose of magic is and how we should help or harm others. I loved all of the discussions in this. There's always really great focus on family and on friendship and on responsibility and growing up. And it's just the sweetest story. I really love this one, and I do have a review for the entire series, so that is linked below. And my top middle grade for this year is Sal and Gabi Break the Universe by Carlos Hernandez, as well as Sal and Gabi Fix the Universe, which is its sequel. So this is such a great duology. I loved it so much. We follow Sal, who is recently moved to Miami with his family and is attending a new school. He is Cuban American, and so are most of the other characters in this. And this new school is a special arts school. He is a magician. He loves performing, but it turns out he actually has real ability to reach through to other dimensions and bring things from those dimensions into his own. And when he gets to this new school, Gabi, who is the student body president, the newspaper editor, all these sorts of things, gets a little suspicious about the magic tricks that he's doing. This book and the whole series is just filled with everything that I want. Not only is there all of this SFF in it, there's so much about these multi-dimensions and about how he can bring things in and what the consequences of that are, these holes in the dimensions, and it's just so cool. But also all of the themes. This series does such an amazing job of really addressing a lot of very deep things like grief, things like abuse of children, things like dealing with disability. Sal has type 1 diabetes, and it's very much a part of the story, even if it's not the focus, but you know, the way that his school needs to accommodate him. And really what I think that this book and this series do is that it models so many great behaviors. So it models non-toxic masculinity. It models trying to handle your emotions and your impulsivity. It models how to repair relationships when you've made a mistake. It models how to acknowledge and apologize for your mistakes. It models how to support each other. It's just so beautiful, and overall, all of this is just so funny. Carlos Hernandez has such a hilarious writing style. You laugh the entire time you're reading these books. It brought me so much joy. And I do have a review for the first book in this series. I strongly recommend it. Definitely one of the highlights of my year. The next category is YA, beginning with Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. This is a sort of fantastical near future where our main character Jam, who is a teenage girl, lives in a utopian place, Lucille, where there used to be monsters, but some angels came and people worked really hard. They got rid of all the monsters, and now it's a perfect place. Or is it? One day, a painting that Jam's mother has done of this sort of being with feathers and all sorts of things comes to life and tells Jam that there actually is a monster in Lucille, and she has to uncover what's going on with that, even though nobody in Lucille believes that monsters exist anymore. This is beautifully written. The language that is used is gorgeous. The atmosphere of it, the fantasy, the feel of it is just beautiful. I especially love the way that the being from the painting, Pet, talks, because there's a lot of alliteration. It's almost like poetry. The topics that this discusses are really good, but it's done in a way that is very approachable, and I just love the world building, and I love everything that this book had to say, so I strongly recommend it. Next is Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is a contemporary YA told in verse about two half-sisters, Gahaida, who lives in New York, and Camino, who lives in the Dominican Republic. And one day there is a plane crash and their father passes away, and through that they learn that they are related, that their father had another family in a different country. And so this story is all about them processing the grief over losing somebody who was so important to them, while also processing the anger over finding out that their father was leading a double life. It's also about them connecting as sisters. And I really love that the way that this is told in verse from the two different perspectives, and the way that it also addresses a lot of issues of privilege and of money and access that is different between the two sisters. It moved me so much. I do have a standalone review, so I will link that below, and I just strongly loved this book. And my top YA for this year is Elatsoe by Darcy Little Badger. This one brought my heart so much joy. It is a contemporary urban fantasy that follows Ellie, who is a teenage girl that is Lipin Apache. And she lives in Texas in a world that is basically the same as our own, except that magical beings exist. And so there are all sorts of beings from different histories, different stories, different lore. So there are vampires, there are scarecrow men, and there are also traditional Lipin Apache beings. So things like a coyote woman, things like that. And we follow Ellie as she deals with something pretty important that happens in her life. So her cousin dies in a car accident and comes to her in a dream and lets her know that it was not an accident, that it was actually murder. And so she has to go and investigate this, because of course the police aren't going to be investigating what happens to an indigenous person. She has a dog companion who is a ghost, because she has a skill that is taught in her family of raising the ghosts of animals, and she has great friends and her family helps, and this whole story is about so many beautiful themes. It is about justice. It is about the way that indigenous peoples are treated. It is about the way that we need to be responsible and respectful of powers. There is so much in this about especially the way that many people who have privilege or who have that kind of colonizer mindset treat things and treat resources and people. So this has a lot of really deep themes, but it also is just super sweet. It's a murder mystery, and it's got excellent fantasy. It made my heart so happy to read this. I do have an entire standalone review linked below, and I really hope that you guys will check that out or check the book out, because I loved it so much. The next category is memoirs, starting with Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. This is a beautiful memoir that is a middle grade told in verse, where Jacqueline Woodson really tells the memoir of her childhood, of her growing up in the 1960s as a Black girl who split her time between South Carolina and New York. And so there's so much in this sort of about the civil rights movement, sort of about that experience that a lot of Black families have of the Great Migration North, about the ties to the South. There's also just so much in here about her dreams, her dealing with dyslexia, but also wanting to become a writer. There's just so many beautiful things that are both historical and personal in this, and it's all done in verse that is just gorgeous. I love Jacqueline Woodson's writing. I loved this memoir, and I do have a standalone review for it linked below. Next is The Best We Could Do by Djèlí, which is a graphic memoir/biography. So this is the story of Djèlí, whose family, when she was a very young child, were refugees from Vietnam and came to the US. So it's her story growing up as a refugee who came to the US and adapted to living here, but it's also the story of her parents. It's the story of their time in Vietnam and sort of the forces that shaped them, and the coping mechanisms that they had to develop to deal with what was going on, all of that civil unrest in Vietnam, and how that translated into the way that they raised her and her siblings, and how there was a lot of generational trauma that was passed on. So this book also has so much in it about the history of the Vietnam War, about really the way that Vietnamese immigrants were treated and how they fit into society, but also it's just so personal about her relationship and the problems with it and the love, but also the pain that goes into her and her parents' relationship. It's beautifully written. It's really heartrending at times, but I got so much out of it. I did do a standalone review for that, so I will link it below as well. And my top memoir of 2020 was Good Talk by Mira Jacob. This is a memoir that Mira Jacob has done that isn't really chronological, but rather is a series of conversations that she has with people in her life. So her son, her husband, her parents, her friends. And it is done in such a beautiful way. It's a really unique graphic memoir in that it has pictures and dialogue, but it's done in a very unique style where there's just sort of cutouts for her at certain ages. And that's the picture of her that is used in each of these dialogues in that section. I really, really loved all of the discussions that this had. It's so much about identity, about race. Her parents are Indian immigrants to the US, and she grew up fully in the US, but you know, as somebody who is visibly darker skinned. So there's a lot of discussions about racism and about privilege and about expectations. There's a lot of discussions of really the immigrant experience and about different expectations that she has versus her parents have. There's a lot in here too about raising her son. So her husband is white and Jewish, and so her son is dealing with a lot of different marginalizations in that way, some of which her husband can understand and some of which he can't. And especially poignant was that, you know, the discussions that she had with her son in 2016 when Trump was elected, and just all of these things about how brown people are treated, and also discusses things like 9/11 because she lived in New York and just how that affected things. It's just filled with so many great discussions that are about identity and about politics. My husband Sush and I did an entire discussion of all of these themes really in depth, so I will link that below, although I do warn it's a little bit long, but there is so much to get out of this collection. I loved it so much, and I definitely recommend it. The next category is poetry collections, beginning with When My Brother Was an Aztec by Natalie Diaz, who is a queer Latinx Mojave author. This poetry collection is beautiful. I am so impressed by Diaz's ability to use so much imagery and so much emotion. She really draws on a lot of literary allusions. She really uses a lot of colors and themes to make her poems so vivid and emotional. She also covers a ton of themes that I just think are so fascinating. She talks about being Indigenous and about what that means for her identity. She talks about her brother in particular who had a drug addiction and how that affected her family. She talks about just so much that is very, very personal, and this poetry collection just connected in such an emotional way. I really loved both this and her other collection, and I did a standalone review of both of those, so I'll link that below. Next is Sana Sana by Ariana Brown. Ariana Brown is a queer Black Latinx poet, and the emotion that is in this poetry collection is so powerful. So I really loved the way that not just the rhythm of these poems, but the way that the emotion is so in your face. There's so much anger in this volume, but also so much self-love. So in this poetry collection, Ariana Brown really explores her identity as a Black girl, her identity as somebody who is Latinx, but not necessarily as connected with that heritage as she wants. There's a lot of explorations of language and of Black hair and of just who she is and how society around her doesn't necessarily respect that, but how she loves who she is. I really loved this. I do have a standalone review for it, so I will link that below. And my top poetry collection for 2020 was Peluda by Melissa Lozada Oliva, who is a Latinx poet. I loved this one so much. This is the one that I really, really deeply connected to. Just somehow the way that she wrote about her experiences spoke so deeply to me. So in this poetry collection, the title is Peluda, which means hairy one. And there's all of these discussions about sort of the way that she doesn't fit the mold of what she should be. So she has too much body hair. She has too much Latinx heritage. She has too much that isn't what is the norm or what is expected. And she is in so many instances kind of navigating this tension that she feels between wanting to fit into mainstream American society, but also wanting to embrace those aspects of her that are rejected, those aspects of her that are part of her heritage. So I just really loved that exploration. I loved the imagery, and there's also a ton of humor in this. I found it really, really funny, even though there's also so much emotion. I loved the way that she especially explored her relationship with her mother. So this poetry collection was another favorite of mine, and I do have a standalone review for that linked below. So I hope you will check that out or check the poetry collection out. The next category is romance, starting with The Lady's Guide to Celestial Mechanics by Olivia Waite. This is a historical female-female romance that is really, really lovely. So we follow two women. The first is Lucy, whose father was an astronomer, as is she, but her work isn't really recognized in the way that his was. And we follow Catherine, who is a countess, and she ends up becoming the patron of Lucy to help her get some funding to translate a great work of astronomy from French into English. So this story I thought was beautiful in two ways. So the first way is the romance. I really liked the relationship between Lucy and Catherine. I liked the way that they respected each other. I liked the way that they were there to support each other and really boost each other up and say, you can do it. I really liked that kind of respect and support. And then the other thing that I loved about this, I mean, one, I do really like historical romances, but two, I really liked the way that this discussed so many issues, really taking a feminist kind of view of the way that women's work was treated in the 1800s. And so looking at the way that Lucy's astronomy work is just dismissed, even though she's doing great things, looking at the way that Catherine, who is an artist that sews, so she does embroidery, that her art is just dismissed as women's work. It's not art itself. And just the way that this story kind of takes a look at the value of these women, the value of what they are doing is really beautiful. So I had such a fun time with this one. Next is If the Boot Fits by Rebecca Weatherspoon, which is the sequel to A Cowboy to Remember. This is a contemporary romance that is a loose Cinderella retelling, and it is so sweet. It is so funny. I had such a great time reading this. So we follow Sam, who is an actor that has just won an Oscar, and at the after party, he ends up hooking up with and having a one-night stand with a mysterious woman. This woman then leaves the next day and he doesn't even know her name. So the woman is Amanda, and she is somebody who has dreams of becoming a writer, but for now she is just kind of the lowly assistant to a TV minor celebrity, and really she's the Cinderella of the story. I thought that this was just such a sweet story. It is something where the Cinderella aspects you can definitely see, but it's not overdone. It's very subtle, and it really makes you love the characters. I loved the way that Amanda and Sam navigated their relationship, especially with sort of the disparate circumstances that they each faced. They had a ton of respect for each other. I especially loved that the way that they respected boundaries, because both of them had issues when it came to privacy, and Amanda especially had a lot of requirements in terms of going slow and not getting too involved too quickly. There was just a lot of I love respect in my romance novels, but there was also a lot of sexual chemistry, and there was a ton of banter. Lots and lots of very funny banter between them. Plus, there were really great supportive side characters. They had great family and friends who were there for them. So I loved all of that. I also liked the way that this talked about Amanda and her dreams, and really talked about kind of what she was willing to put up with in order to get to her dreams and what she shouldn't put up with, those kind of boundaries as well. And Sam too, figuring out what he wants in life. So there's just great personal growth and discussion for each of these characters, and such a beautiful relationship together. I really, really loved this one. And my top romance novel for this year is Take a Hint, Dani Brown by Talia Hibbert, which is the sequel to Get a Life, Chloe Brown. This, oh my gosh, this made my heart so, so happy. I love Talia Hibbert's writing, and this story was just perfect for me. So this is a contemporary romance about two characters. Dani, who is finishing up her PhD and is super, super directed. She has so much that she wants to get done academically and professionally. She does not have time for relationships, but she does want a sex buddy. So she prays to the Orishas, asking for some sign that she could find somebody to be her sex buddy. Then we have Zaf, who is an ex-rugby player, but he now works as a security guard in the building where Dani teaches. And one day there is a fire alarm, and he sort of whisks her out of the building. Pictures are taken, it goes viral, and they decide to start fake dating because it would help him get some funding for a nonprofit rugby organization that he runs. So this is such a sweet story. I especially loved the characters. Dani, I really relate with. She's just very motivated and directed. She knows what she wants. And Zaf is a guy who is just the sweetest. He loves reading romance novels. He is very in touch with his kind of inner emotions. He has anxiety and has to deal with that a lot. He's just the sweetest cinnamon roll. He makes me so emotionally happy. He reminds me a lot of Sush in many ways, just that sweet guy character. And I loved that their romance. There was so much funny banter. Talia Hibbert is a hilarious writer, and I just really loved the way that they came together, and the way that Dani kind of had to process some of her emotions and get over her hangups against being in a relationship. So this one just made me so happy. I did do an entire standalone review for it, so I will link that below. The next category is historical fiction, starting with The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. This is set in the 1960s in Florida, and we follow a black teenage boy, Elwood, who has such a bright future. He is a very upstanding citizen. He loves to listen to Martin Luther King Jr. Records. He is so passionate about civil rights. He wants to go to college. He's hardworking, such a great kid. And then something happens, and he accidentally gets caught up in something where he gets arrested and sent to the Nickel Academy, which is a reform school. The Nickel Academy is based on a real place that existed into, I think, the 90s in Florida, and it was not a good place. So he gets thrown into this very difficult, very violent, very abusive school for boys, and it's all about him and a friend that he makes there, Turner, who are trying to survive this experience, and the way that their values sort of change over time, and also the repercussions later in life of being part of the Nickel Academy. This is Such a beautiful book. I really, really loved the historical aspects. I really loved Colson Whitehead's writing style. I think also that the topic of this sounds incredibly heavy, but the reading of it was not. I think that Colson Whitehead is very gentle with the reader. There's a lot of ways that he acknowledges what was going on without dragging you through such violent scenes. So this is a beautiful book. I really, really liked the way that it talked about the effect of these traumatic events, and also really talked about how so much of that history of just injustice done against Black boys is still very much a part of our current modern day world, and how we can't forget about it, how it really connects with what is going on now. So this had great messages, a great story. I cared so deeply about the characters, and it was just such a beautifully written book. I definitely recommend it. Next is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is set in the 1950s, and we follow a butler, Stevens, who is going on a road trip and sort of reflecting on his life. So he has been a butler his whole life at Darlington Hall, where he took a lot of pride in what he was doing as a butler. But times are changing. Things are very different in the 1950s than they were in the 1920s and 30s in sort of his heyday. And so this whole story is really him kind of looking back at that history, as well as where he is now and those changes. This book is just beautiful. I really especially loved that Stevens is an incredibly unreliable narrator. You have to read a lot into what he doesn't say and kind of interpret it in your own way. It unfolds very beautifully, almost like a mystery, even though it's not a mystery, but as you go, you're trying to really uncover what actually was going on, since he is not somebody who's that aware of his own emotions even. So it's a super beautiful book, really, really well written, so immersive and engaging. And I just like the way that it discusses these ideas of the choices that we make and what we decide to value. And my favorite historical fiction this year was Cantoras by Carolina de Robertes, which is set in the 1970s and 80s in Uruguay. So we follow a group of 5 queer women in Uruguay, and Uruguay had a very, very strict authoritarian dictatorship at that point, where it was not okay to be queer. So they are all struggling with the oppressive regime, with the way that they cannot be themselves and are forced into all of these choices in life that are not what they would choose. But they come together and they end up finding a little remote seaside town where they can be free. So they keep coming to this beachside town throughout the years, finding each other, finding a space where they can be themselves. It is so, so beautiful. The writing in this is spectacular. It is such gorgeous lyrical writing, so much imagery. The history in this is really, really fascinating. And just this story of queer women who find themselves, find their identity, find their space to be free, their community, it is so inspiring. I absolutely, absolutely loved this book, and I do have a standalone review for it, which I will link below. Now moving on to literary fiction, beginning with Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. This is really the story of 2 families. So the first family is the Richardsons, which is a white, upper middle class, very privileged family that lives in Shaker Heights, a sort of utopian suburb of Cleveland. And they rent out a small little extra house they have to another family, Mia, who is a single mother, and her daughter, Pearl. So this story really is about these 2 families interacting, and in particular, the differences that they have in the way that they live their lives, in their levels of privilege, and the way that they see how to interact with other people. This story was great, not just because of how really intriguing it was. There's a lot of mystery in this, a lot of things that you don't really understand in the beginning that are unfolded as you go along, but also just in the themes that it addresses, especially the themes of privilege. There's a lot in here about privilege, and a lot in here about people who are in that sort of privileged position, who think that they are very progressive, but when push comes to shove, how do they actually act? I really, really loved this. I thought that it was excellently written, and I just got so much out of the themes. Next is We Need New Names by No Violet Bulawayo. So this is the story of Darling, a 10-year-old girl in Zimbabwe who lives in a shanty town. Her family used to have an actual house, these sorts of things, but there was a lot of economic and civil unrest and they lost everything. And so she's now living in a shack, running around in the streets, kind of dealing with life. We see this from her perspective, and her voice as this young child is very, very strong. I loved the way that this was written. I loved her perspective. She is in a situation where there are a lot of bad things around her, but she sees it through the eyes of an innocent. And so it's very interesting as the reader to read what's going on where you understand what actually is happening, but she, as the narrator, does not. It's got a lot of play with language, and it's just very, very immersive. As a teenager, she ends up moving to the US to live with an aunt, and so there's also this second half of the book is really talking about that experience, that immigrant experience, and discussing a lot of issues of connection to home country versus opportunities in a new one. So this book had fantastic themes. I thought the writing was spectacular, and it just was so moving in so many ways, getting the perspective of Darling going through all of these different experiences. So I did do a standalone review for this one. I will link it below. I really, really loved this one. And my top literary fiction for this year was What It Means When a Man Falls from the Sky by Leslie Negarima. So this is a short story collection that I think is just outstanding. Every single story in this I gave 5 stars because I thought they were all fantastic. These stories are really especially looking at Nigerian women and looking at the way that women have relationships with their parents, looking at the way that they are treated by society, looking at a lot of expectations on women, looking at a lot of the experience of being in Nigeria or being an immigrant from Nigeria to another country. These stories in this were just so well written. There's a lot of darkness in this collection. It really does have some heavy themes, and a lot of bad things happen to the characters, but I thought this was just one of the best short story collections I have ever read. It is really, truly amazing, and I do have a standalone review for that, so I will link it below. The next category is horror, which, if you know me, is a little bit of a surprise, but I actually read quite a few horror novels this year, and some of them were just so good that I decided I needed to have an entire category for this. So the first book on this list is Small Spaces by Catherine Arden. This is a middle grade horror, and I think this is absolutely fantastic because middle grade horror has a lot of the creepy atmosphere, but doesn't necessarily have like the violence and the gore that adult horror has. So this tells the story of Ollie, who is a very difficult young girl. She has, she's dealing with some issues in her life, and she comes across one day a woman who's throwing a book into a river, and Ollie is very much a reader and not okay with that, grabs the book, and in the book it talks about some very scary things that are happening, and it sounds like it's sort of a diary, a memoir, but it is very creepy. Then she goes on a field trip with her school to a farm in a remote area, and a lot of things from that book seem to be happening on that trip. So it is very creepy. I really loved it. I really loved the way that Ollie dealt with problems, not always the best choices, but I really liked the way that that unfolded, and I liked the way that she had relationships with other people and how that evolved throughout the story. There's a lot in here about her needing to kind of grow in certain areas. So loved the atmosphere and loved those themes, and just such an engaging read. Next is Ring Shout by P. Djèlí Clark. This is a dark fantasy horror set in the 1920s in Georgia. We follow Maurice, who is a Black woman, and two of her other friends who all have a special ability to see monsters. So where they are, there are a lot of members of the KKK, and some of them are inhabited by these monsters called Ku Kluxes from another dimension. Maurice and her friends can see them and they fight against them. This is very much a story of it's got a ton of action. It's got a lot of really interesting themes. There is a bit of violence and gore, but it also has these great kind of horror sci-fi elements of other dimensions and other beings, and really excellent discussions about racism and hatred and about how we fight against that and sort of what that does to us and what we should be really using as our tools to fight against it. It also has absolutely beautiful writing. A lot of this is written in dialect, and it just is so engaging. I love P. Djèlí Clark's writing, and I do have a standalone review for this, which I will link below. And my top horror for this year is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is set in the 1950s in Mexico, and we follow a socialite, Noemi, who is all about parties and dresses and flirting, except that one day she gets a letter from her cousin, Catalina, who a year ago married a mysterious stranger and moved up to a remote place in the mountains. So her cousin seems to be seeing things, and things are not going well for her. So Noemi goes to investigate and finds out that, yeah, the place where Catalina has moved and that family are creepy. So this story is so beautiful. I love the way that Silvia Moreno Garcia takes on writing this creepy atmosphere. I love the way that she has integrated so much of Mexican history into the story, and I really like the take that she has done on the Gothic genre. I like the way that she takes many of the tropes from that, but also does her own twist on it, which is very, very feminist and very much from the Mexican perspective. So the family that Catalina has married into are of British descent, and so there's a lot of discussions about colonialism and about racism and eugenics and all sorts of things. So this book is filled with really great themes, really great atmosphere, definitely creepy. There's a lot of creepy things happening in this, and it's just such a great read. I loved the way that the mystery sort of unfolded as well, where you're given hints throughout that make it make sense when it finally unfolds, but you're also left guessing for a big part of the story. So I thoroughly enjoyed this book. Definitely an excellent read, and I do have a standalone review, which I will link below. The next category is fantasy, starting with The 100 Nights of Hero by Isabel Greenberg. This is an illustrated, almost short story collection of myths and fantasy. This is basically kind of an Arabian Nights retelling that is set in this universe that Greenberg has created. So we follow two women, Cherry and Hero, who are in love with each other, but Cherry is under threat from some very bad men, and so Hero has to tell stories each night to kind of keep them entertained. So we get all of these different stories. So each of these stories is a very interesting take on different myths and fairy tales and classical stories, but done in a different setting, in a different world that Greenberg has created. I loved the artwork in this. I loved the kind of fantasy mythology world building of it. I loved the queerness of this story, and I loved the humor. There's a lot of little bits of humor written throughout this. I really like Greenberg's way of creating these beautiful illustrated fantasy worlds. So this is absolutely excellent. I strongly recommend it. I definitely bought myself a physical copy because I loved this so much. Next is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clark. This is sort of like a historical Regency society type of story that also has dark fantasy in it. So it is following basically the Regency period, except that it is a world where magic actually exists, except that it has kind of fallen by the wayside until Mr. Norrell comes and revives magic. So this story really follows Mr. Norrell and then his kind of apprentice, Jonathan Strange, throughout many years as they get magic back into English society. It's also very much talking about historical events of that time, like the Napoleonic Wars, but there's magic, there are elves, and very interesting dark things going on with that kind of elven magic that are integrated. This is not a story for people who like plot, but it's very much a story for people who like that kind of Regency era, who like that sort of fantasy of manners type of story, who like atmosphere, who like just that slow unfolding of the world building. This was a very long book that I just loved being immersed in, so I thoroughly enjoyed this one. And my top fantasy for 2020 was The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nivo. This is a novella that I thought was spectacular. It is the story of an empress who came from the north and was basically forced to marry and bear the son to the southern emperor, after which he banished her. So this is a story told many years later through flashbacks of a handmaiden to that empress. And it's really beautifully written. There's a lot of imagery in this. I loved the sort of Vietnamese inspired fantasy world, the way that there's a lot of political intrigue, the way that it's very feminist, it's also very queer. It's just beautifully written, and in such a short period in a novella, the amount of world building that is done, I think, is absolutely fantastic. I do have a standalone review for this, so I will link that below. And for the last category, science fiction, the first book is Prime Meridian by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is a sci-fi novella that takes place in sort of a near future Mexico City, and we follow Amelia, who is very much down and out. She is dealing with having not very much come of her life. Nothing is really working out. She's poor, she's getting by on the gig economy, but she dreams of going to the colonies on Mars. And so all of this book is sort of a take on cyberpunk. It's very gritty in a lot of ways, but it's also something that is really looking at the way that women are treated, that their dreams are treated. It's looking at the idea of sort of taking what you need to get ahead. There's a lot of very interesting things going on in this novella. Amelia is very much an unlikable character who makes a lot of bad decisions, but I really like what was going on in this and a lot of the themes. So I do have a standalone review for this if you're interested, and that will be linked below. Next is Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is a science fiction novel that takes a look at a very long span of time. So this book unfolds over hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. So we follow a group of people who have left Earth. Earth has become uninhabitable, and so they are on a spaceship searching for a new planet, and it takes them many, many generations to find a new planet. And when they find the new planet, they discover that there are alien beings that live there. They are very different. And we also follow the perspective of those beings as they evolve and change over the years. So this is very much a book that takes a look at the ideas of the way that we evolve, at the way that we structure our societies, and how that might be different for humans versus different types of beings. It takes a look at the different ways that we would value things or view things, the different ways that technology would evolve based on our needs, and the way that those two kind of cultures coming into contact would deal with each other. I loved all of the philosophical discussions in this. I loved seeing the way that these societies evolved. I loved all of that discussion, and it was so atmospheric. This is definitely not a book if you're looking for like characters or plot, but if you're looking for just philosophical ideas and themes and kind of that atmosphere, I think it's absolutely excellent. So I really enjoyed it. And my top science fiction read of 2020 was Network Effect by Martha Wells. This is the 5th book in the Murderbot Diaries series, and I loved it so much. It brought me so much happiness. If you're not familiar with the series, Murderbot is a security unit, basically an android that also has some organic parts that is just there to kind of protect humans, except that it hacks its governor module so that it actually has free will, which it mainly uses to watch soap operas. It's a very antisocial unit. It does not like dealing with emotions or people or anything like that, but it gets involved in trying to save humans because they keep getting into messes. So this has a very interesting universe where there's a lot of kind of dystopian corporate everything elements, but also there's so much that is beautiful about like mixed families and all sorts of different queer characters, and it's such a beautiful world while also a little dystopian. And Murderbot is hilarious, so funny. This series reads so quick, it is so much fun, and this newest installment is just awesome. It was just so cool to read. There's all of this action, all of this mystery, all of this intrigue, and fun, such fun. So many great characters, especially because Art, one of my favorite characters from one of the earlier books, makes a reappearance, and I just love the dynamic between Murderbot and Art. I do have a review of the whole series, so I will link that below if you're interested, but this is just one that brought me so much joy. Okay, so those are my favorites of 2020. I know this was a long list, but trust me, I cut out so many books that I loved in order to make it just 10 categories. I hope that some of these books are ones that you've gotten to and have loved. If you have read any of these, if you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them below, or if any of these are on your TBR and you want to get to them, anything at all, just go ahead and leave me a comment down below.